Hi, my name is Noah Gift, and I'm going to talk about a subject that I think is an interesting subject for new people to the software industry, or maybe if you've been in the industry for a few years, to think about how can you proactively manage your career and think more in terms of designing for failure. One of the things that I've seen in my career, I've been working for, believe it or not, about 35 years. When I was 10 years old, actually, I was starting to work professionally for my dad's television company. And then I kind of went through the ropes in different industries and learned a lot of things along the way. And one of the things that I've learned is that it's important to have a proactive plan for a career. And in particular, one of the things I learned with tech is that there needs to be, I would say, somewhere between 1 to 2 hours a day where you're focusing on learning something that may or may not be directly related to what your job is. And this is important because this is a form of an investment because technology changes. I would say every 6 months, something's going to change the technology, and you need to be looking out for what those changes are, investing in it, and then studying it while you're in the workplace. And so one of the ways that I would do this when I was working for Fortune 500 companies or for startups was I would show up a little bit early to work and then spend some time, focusing on technology and making sure that I knew that next thing so that I could get the next job. So that's one key component of being proactive about your career. Another one that isn't really talked about a lot is that you should always be preparing for your next job. Really, the tenure of most people is 1 to 2 years. They don't really stick around much. And it's possible if you're startups, they have this expression, fire fast, and you could be there 6 months and you're fired. And so I think it's important to have all of the components ready because you're designing for failure. So what are the components that are necessary for you to get a job? Well, I say portfolio is really critical. So that's something you could constantly work on throughout your career. Let's say even if you're employed at a company for 10 years, imagine if you just spent, let's say, an hour a week updating open source projects you're working on, different things that show your skill set, and just constantly keeping that portfolio ripe and ready. I would say it's better than a resume is to have a very fresh and relevant portfolio. And so let's talk about some techniques that you can use for that particular portfolio. One of the things that I would recommend is that if you're able to create an open source project, let's say a command line tool or a little web framework, that does some kind of an API call that does machine learning, or an iOS app, or some kind of utility where you can work on it for the next several years or several open source projects. I think that's a really great way to maintain your skill set and really have some leverage against your current employer. I think that's another thing that's not really talked about, is that you should intentionally have some kind of a leverage so that, again, if your employer doesn't want you around, that's fine. You already have a bunch of credibility and respect in industry, and it's easy for someone else to hire you immediately. So that's one of the things I think that is critical is, what is your leverage, and do you have leverage in terms of technical skills that are current and a portfolio that reflects your work? And this is really a way of being proactive about your career. So let's get into the details on this a little bit because I think it's such an important topic, and then we'll go from there and wrap things up. Okay, let's think about here what are some of the things that are important in terms of failure, right? What would a venture capitalist do when they were designing a company from scratch? Well, to start with, they would go through here and build something where they're assuming that companies are going to fail, and so they want to be successful regardless. And in your own career, you can do the same thing. You can say maybe in 10 years, you're going to work at 5 companies. That's probably an average, 1 to 3 years per company. And in general, what can you do to mitigate the fact that you're going to change and have problems? Well, one is open source software, right? So you can build proactively an open source software project from the beginning of your career. That's ideal. Already get some traction, and then continue to work on that project at all the companies that you're working at. And so you have really a work artifact you can show people. So company A, you start there, you start contributing maybe after hours or before work. Company B, you keep working on this project, and they're able to even use some of your work in the project, maybe work at it at work. Company C, again, you maybe have some problems because they don't want you to work on that project anymore. They hate it. Well, really, it's none of their business. You can keep working on it. It's open source software. Other people can keep working on it. Company D, you go back to doing more of it at work. And then maybe even the last company you work at is actually the product you're working on. So you could actually spend your time building maybe something that gets funding, right? You could get a startup capital, but in general, why not invest long-term into yourself by using an open source project? So I think that's one career strategy here when you're thinking about designing for failure. Now, additionally here, we have this concept of a portfolio, which is related to the open source project, but also I think important on its own in that why not be spending time before you need to switch into a new position, already having people contact you, recruiters reaching out to you, other companies reaching out to you because they see your work. Now, if you're working only on items inside of one of these companies, then really nobody knows what you're doing. But by building a portfolio and constantly putting new things into it, you're building an asset. So you're again thinking like an investor, not like an employee. And I think this is a critical thing to think about, is to be proactive with your career, not reactive. Investors are proactive, right? They're investing in real estate so that they can, sell it at a profit later. Same thing goes now with venture capitalists. So let's dive here into the way a venture capitalist will think. So in general, it's similar, right? You have a whole basket of different companies. Let's say you have around 10 companies that you're investing in, and you're assuming from the very beginning as a venture capitalist that, let's say, a large percentage of those companies will fail. And if you have, let's say, $1 million and you put it into each one, let's say you put $10 million in, of those 10 companies, 9 of those companies will completely fail. And you're actually assuming that they'll fail. Now, you may say something differently depending on your ethics to the individual employees. You may say, hey, work harder than you've ever worked in your life. This is your best shot at fame. Of course, you're not doing that because you're not working harder than you've ever worked in your life. You're hoping other people will work harder than they've ever worked in their life for you so that they can take the risk, and then you can actually create a portfolio so that you have minimal risk but always constant guaranteed upside. Really, that's the concept, right? Is that if you have one company that gets a 10x return, then or 100x return, then you've either made even, you're broken even, or you've made a profit. And so this is really designing for failure from the beginning. Of course, they don't tell you this when you're working and you're starting off, is to minimize your risk in companies. But there are investors that are absolutely doing this. They're thinking about their portfolio of companies. Now, in your case, though, why should you compromise your health or compromise your family? Your kids are only a certain age once. So my recommendation would be to think like a venture capitalist. Don't get sucked into the glory of betting it all, essentially, like putting all your money on a chip on the roulette wheel. Instead, assume that these companies will fail. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do an exceptional job at work. Do an exceptional job at work, but be really critical with thinking about how you can minimize things. So, for example, at many startups, they like to use this phrase. The first thing you should consider is should you invest? And the second thing that you should consider is when to fire the founders. So from the very beginning, they're assuming that they're going to even fire the people that are working at the company. I've had famous venture capitalists tell me that in person to my face. So I know that this is the way that they think. And in particular, what if you thought this way, where you were able to fire bad companies when they got bad? You never know. You could get a different boss or it becomes toxic. But because you have a portfolio, you have minimal cost of living, it doesn't matter. So now let's get into a little bit more details here about the specifics of what we're talking about. In particular, how do I actually minimize the risks in my career and actually think more like a venture capitalist? Well, one of the ways that you can do that is by designing a system from the very beginning to assume that there'll be these problems. So, for example, one of the things I would recommend is work a sane work week, a 40-hour work week, or whatever is required. I wouldn't work extra work at your job. Again, do an exceptional job, do A+ work, do incredible work, but you need to also be recovering, taking care of your family, making sure that you're also investing in your own portfolio and the relationships that you have. So I think this is really a critical asset that is not really talked about. In fact, I made these mistakes. I definitely fell for the promises of putting everything in one company. I would think as well, the open source software is a critical component to your strategy of minimizing risk. So all this does is keeps you happy, keeps you healthy, makes sure that you have a good portfolio, and also allows you to move if you need to. Related to this, I've read many articles from venture capitalists that talk about how a particular location is the only location everything will work. Of course, they happen to live in that location and they happen to be incredibly wealthy or were born wealthy. And the difference between you and them is that your cost of living actually matters. And so I think this is another critical component, is the lower your cost of living, the lower risk you have, because you're not putting all of those profits into a landlord somewhere. Instead, you're able to keep a pool of money aside in case you need it. Likewise, a side project is a great way to generate revenue and also to generate experience, and that's something to think about. So again, let's get into the details here of designing for failure. What's one of the things that you can do? Well, I would say assume your career, each company is going to be 1 to 3 years. Make sure that you're designing your strategy accordingly, and making sure that you're doing networking so you have good relationships with people at your work. You're not burning bridges. You're also reaching out constantly to new people, making connections, always testing the water for if there's a new position. Another thing you could be thinking about is getting your name out there, writing blog posts, writing books, creating content. All of those things will establish your credibility so that if you do need to move, it's really an easy move. And then another one I think that's not talked about enough is certification. Can you go through, get certified? And so all of these things allow you to more quickly make moves into new positions and minimize your risk. And so you're thinking more like a venture capitalist and less like a reactive employee. And this is, I think, one of the critical decisions you can make in your career. Okay, so I talked about some of the things that you can do to be more proactive about building a career in the software industry and actually thinking like a venture capitalist thinks, right? I think this is one of the things that's easy to do if you haven't been around life-changing money, or you're not independently wealthy, or you're not as part of the 0.01 or 1%, is that what can you do to minimize your risk? Again, the people that are funding a company are not taking the personal risks that you're taking. They're not putting their life really all in one company. They're not jeopardizing their health by working crazy hours. They're also not neglecting their family. These are all things that if you're able to really keep a balance and do exceptional work, but make yourself healthy, invest in yourself. Think about what a professional athlete does. Some of the best will spend $1 million a year. You don't have to spend that much money, but to keep yourself healthy, happy, constantly, keeping the latest technologies, but then also assuming between 1 to 3 years out, you're going to switch a position. So already be multiple steps ahead. So what can you do to already be ready? Let's say, for example, here's another scenario that comes up a lot, is that you first get into a company, a VC funded company, and then your boss is amazing, right? And there's lots of amazing bosses. And then it turns out that that boss is actually not mean enough, right? And they want to get a mean boss in, and they fire your boss, and now you got a mean boss. Now what do? Well, I think one of the things that's great about already assuming that those bad things will happen is you already have a plan for it. If you need to switch companies, you switch companies. If your cost of living is low, who cares? You just move to a new location. All of these things are a great way to prepare yourself to be at your best no matter what company you're at. And if you do these things, I guarantee you'll be able to minimize a lot of the disruptions that happen in the tech industry.